Well, thank you, Lee, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. We're delighted to speak here today, and
There is a clue for that.
okay, thank you. Just a few updates. I think we need to update our website. I actually am associate professor of Spanish as of spring 2024, and my research used to focus on medieval and early modern Spanish literature. My research now focuses on Spanish for the health professions, although I still teach and I specialize in the Renaissance, medieval Renaissance, early modern period in Spain and the Spanish American colonies in my teaching. And so today I'm accompanied by 4 of my students in my Introduction to Hispanic Literature class. And this is an opportunity for them to showcase what they've been learning in the class and make connections between medieval Spain all the way to 17th century Mexico, the viceroyalty. So they're going to synthesize and talk to you a bit about how 4 poems, 3 poets, 4 poems dialogue with each other. And particularly, they're going to talk to you about the concepts or the themes of love and death in some poems that range from 15th century Castile or Spain, what is now Spain, to all the way to 17th century Baroque Mexico. So we've been studying this topic in our class, and just a little bit about how we came up with the topic. We were trying to find a topic that maybe had something to do with a Halloween topic or Day of the Dead. We were a little disappointed to find out that Day of the Dead was not celebrated in colonial Mexico. So we went with the topic of the Dance of Death. The first ballad that my student Quinlan Crow is going to talk to you about is called El enamorado y la muerte, or The Lover and Death. Just a little bit of background about this topic. I think it was started in Germany, is where the Danza Macabra may have started. It is definitely a Northern European motif that dates back to the bubonic plague. In Spain, it became popular a little bit later. We only have one manuscript of a 15th century Castilian poem called The Dance of Death, or Danza de la Muerte. And this poem is uniquely Spanish because it aligns more with Catholic Spain's values. So it's the Danza Macabra that was popular in Germany and France, except it has a uniquely Spanish Catholic twist to it. The one copy of this manuscript is housed in the monastery of San Lorenzo del Escorial, which was it's an amazing monastery that was built by King Philip II in the 16th century when he brought the Spanish capital and the court to Madrid. And so if you're ever interested and you would like to see the one copy of the Castilian poem of Danza de la Muerte, it is in the library, the fascinating library of El Escorial. And we have an image of that when Quinn gets to that part of the presentation, we can discuss a little bit further if you're interested. So I am going to hand it over to Quinn, who's going to talk to you about the Spanish ballad, Danza de la Muerte. This was a ballad that came out of oral tradition in Spain, as well as the motif, the literary and artistic motif of the Dance of Death. And so Quinn will tell you more about this ballad, and I'm going to pass out, I have a copy of it. We have copies in the original Spanish, and we have English translations of the 4 poems that are going to be discussed today. So as we get to the poems in the presentation, we'll pass out the copies so that you can follow along. Quinn's going to read the ballad in the original Spanish just because we think it loses a lot in translation, although you can follow along the English translation if you like.
Un sueño soñaba anoche, soñito de alma mía, soñaba con mis amores, que en mis brazos los tenía. Vi entrar señora tan blanca, muy más que la nieve fría, por donde has entrado amor, como has entrado mi vida. Las puertas están cerradas, ventanas y celosías. No soy el amor amante, la muerte que Dios te envía. Hay muerte tan rigorosa, déjame vivir un día. Un día no puede ser, una hora tienes de vida. Muy deprisa se causaba, más deprisa se vestía. Ya se va para la calle, en donde su amor vivía. Ábreme la puerta blanca, ábreme la puerta niña. ¿Cómo te podré yo abrir si la ocasión no es venida? Mi padre no fue al palacio, mi madre no está dormida. Si no me abres esta noche, ya no me abrirás, querida. La muerte me está buscando, junto a ti vida sería. Vete bajo la ventana, donde labraba y cosía. Te echaré cordón de seda, para que subas arriba. Y si el cordón no alcanzare, mis trenzas añadiría. La fina seda se rompe, la muerte que allí venía. Vamos el enamorado, que la hora ya está cumplida. So, as you can see, there is some images of and symbolism of a silk cord, and then the figure of death. And the silk cord is where there is some similarity to the Greek fates, because the silk cord is kind of like a measure of life, and when it's cut, that's when the person dies. Yes, so death personified is a beautiful woman.
Okay, so as Quinn was explaining, in this poem we have death personified with the ideal characteristics, basically of ideal beauty in medieval Spain. So she's a fair white woman, and she creeps into the lover's chamber and basically lures him to his death. And so what we're seeing here is we have a couple things going on. We have the ideal traits of what women were to aspire to look like in the medieval period in Spain. We also have a woman luring a man to his death, which was not original to medieval Spain. It dates back to classical Greek and Roman literature and mythology. But because it's the Renaissance, as Renaissance fans know, this was when Europe went back to their classical roots. So there are a lot of things at play here. The Freudian concept of eros thanatos, we see the juxtaposition of erotic love and death together. The irony here is that the poet is lured by death. He becomes anxious, right, when the lover enters his chamber. And he's got to go out and see his lover, and he begs death for one more day. So he's going to see his lover, his other love interest. And as he's trying to get up into the window, the silk cord that she throws down to him to try to save him snaps and he breaks. Okay, so the irony is that it's really death that lures him to his death, although no one can escape death. And that's the whole idea of the European, the medieval Renaissance idea of the motif of danza de la muerte. I'm going to let you just listen a little bit to the ballad, because this is the original Spanish ballad. So this is, I mean, you can hear these are 20th century Spanish cantautores. So they're poet, musicians. I mean, ballads were meant to be sung. I mean, we read it because we're not singers, but ballads were meant to be sung. So these were the types of ballads that were sung by women when they were taking care of children, or people when they were working on farms or washing clothes. I mean, this is popular Spanish literature. And this is one interesting thing about Spain. I can't speak for the rest of Europe, but something really interesting that happened in the 15th century was not only looking back to a classical past, but also really celebrating the Spanish, the mainstream Spanish, the normal everyday Spanish that's spoken by real people. And so popular tradition. And I think that's one thing that makes Spanish unique. So we see this with the Spanish grammar that was written. It was really celebrating everyday Spanish and everyday Spanish culture, language and culture. Okay, so just some lines that we highlighted in our class that really kind of we teased out in our class were, let me live for one day. For what reason have you entered, love? I'm not love, lover. I'm death. Death is looking for me. The fine silk has broken and death has come. Come, lover, for the hour is already filled. So all of these really echo that idea that death can come at any time. Quinn mentioned the idea of carpe diem, of seize the day, which is good. We're going to see that a little bit later in the Spanish Golden Age, but we can see the roots of it here with the idea of really seizing the day, because one day death is going to come for you. Okay, good. Okay, so here is an image of the manuscript that I mentioned before. So this is the one copy, the original copy, manuscript copy that we have of the 14th century Castilian poem, Dante de la Muerte. This is an extensive poem. Again, this concept was from oral Spanish tradition. This is why we have ballads. Somebody, we don't know who, in the 15th century, probably a cleric, decided that they were going to write an extensive poem called Dante de la Muerte, and so this is housed in the Escorial. And the full title of it is Aquí comienza la danza general, en el cual trata como la muerte dice ansia a todas las criaturas que paran. So basically, the whole title, the English translation is Here begins the general dance of death, which tells how death warns all creatures about the brevity of their lives, the certainty of death for all creatures, death with a very hard dance. Some of these, this was hard to translate. So death is dancing and adds us to its chorus in any comedy. So again, basically the omnipresence of death, the brevity of life, and nobody can escape this. So it's very present in the minds of 15th century Spaniards. Okay, so this is, I'm not going to make you listen to this again, but this is Victor Jara, who was one of the celebrated 20th century canto autores in Spain. This has been sung by several of Spain's famous 20th century canto autores, and it's still sung. So I think that's really fascinating that a ballad from medieval Spain is still sung today and it's still celebrated. So that just shows you how inherent this has become in Spanish culture, these efforts to really go back and celebrate Spain and Castilian culture and the language and culture, that these ballads have survived and they're still celebrated and sung today. Okay, and I am going to turn the presentation over to Jenna, who you're talking about Santa Teresa, right? Who's going to talk to you about Saint Teresa of Avila, moving now into 16th century Spain. And I'm going to pass out copies of her poem.
So the poem today is Vivo sin vivir en mí, which kind of roughly translate to I live without living in myself. Saint Teresa was born in Avila in Spain. She was born in 1515 and lived all the way to 1582. In this kind of period in history, it was a big movement of counter-reformation, directly following the Protestant Reformation in the church. This created some kind of lax rules on how they kind of on the different practices and prayers that they did within the church. She, as well as some others, kind of pushed for it to be more restricted and disciplined. She really wanted that connection with God to be more together, more of a, she almost calls it a marriage to God. And that's what a lot of her poems talk about. And while this is themes of life and death, it's also love and a togetherness with God. A big part of this poem is que muero porque no muero is constantly like in this poem. Throughout it, it's got themes of how life is kind of a liberation. It's the freeing of one's soul and being able to merge with God. It's being able to live fully and experience things fully. It plays on the fact that just because her body dies, her soul persists. Her soul goes to join with God. Death wasn't seen as an obstacle or something to be feared. It was something to be embraced and rejoiced. Oh, how hard these exiles are. This prison, these irons in which the soul is locked, refers to her body. She feels shackled to this body and not being able to be with God, that death would be her liberation.
Hello. In the first handout, I believe you should have a copy of Sister Juana's To a Rose. And that's what I'll begin by reading in Spanish for you. A una rosa. Rosa divina, divina que en gentil cultura eres con tu fragrante sutileza, magisterio púrpuro en la belleza, enseñanza nevada a la hermosura. Amago de la humana arquitectura, ejemplo de la vana gentileza, en cuyo ser unió naturaleza, la cuna alegre y triste sepultura. Cuán altiva en tu pompa, presumida soberbia, el riesgo de morir desdeñas, y luego desmayada y encogida. De tu caduco ser das mustias señas, con que conducta muerte y necia vida, viviendo engañas y muriendo enseñas. Sister Juana she was born in the 17th century, so about a century removed from Santa Teresa, and she was the illegitimate daughter of a Spanish military man in colonial Spain and a Criolla mother. She had very humble beginnings in the village of Nepantla, but that village was near Mexico City, so she did have some access to the culture and civilization that was budding at the time. One source that I read said her mother was illiterate, which puts her life into some really interesting context, because she, from the age of 3, showed this insatiable love of learning. She taught herself how to read at the age of 3, and that you will see is a constant theme throughout her life and her work. At age 13, she was actually received by the Viceroy and the Vicereine of colonial New Spain, and that was a very big deal for her. That couple, very influential couple, became her sponsor and friends throughout her life, and influenced her work quite a bit as well. Because she made, let me make sure I've got the right. Okay, she entered religious life, monastic life, at age 16, mainly because she was averse to the idea of marriage, and that would give her access to time and the ability to just continue her studies, which was her main focus. Her body of work includes prose, drama, and poetry, and we're going to focus on her poetry today. Her life and context, as I mentioned before, she had this insatiable love of learning, and given her time and place, she wanted formal education, but those hopes were dashed because of the nature of her womanhood. There's one record of her attempting to disguise herself as a man to enter the University of Mexico, which is just phenomenal. It didn't work out for her, so she remained self-taught through most of her young adult life, and being in the convent, she was able to continue those studies on her own. Much of her work remains very focused on the rights of women to have access to education. And while we are focusing on her poetry today, I think it's worth mentioning that she, lost it in my notes, one of her first works, I want to make sure I get the full name of it correctly. Apologies. Respuesta a Sor Violeta de la Cruz. That is one of her, it was a personal letter that she wrote that was in response to some backlash she got from the church on some of her ideas. And in that, she defends the rights of women, of learning, that it reaches far beyond her modern era and into the classics. She mentions a lot of very honorable women thinkers in history, and that is considered by many the first feminist manifesto of the New World, of the Americas. So it's worth mentioning that tone of her ideas is kind of present in all of her work. The rara avis, that is Latin for rare bird, and that is what she was referred to by a lot of her contemporaries. Because of her womanhood, she wasn't necessarily accepted for completely who she was, but she was marveled at as kind of this anomaly, almost like she did not receive some of the persecution that the Inquisition brought onto a lot of women, because she was so intellectual and so self-taught that people at least regarded that as an accomplishment and kind of kept her in a different corner and regarded differently as just an anomaly. A quote of hers that I find really interesting: "Si es malo yo no lo sé que nací tan poeta que azotada como odio suenan en metro mis quejas." That is to say, if it is evil, I do not know. I know that I was born such a poet that even whipped as Ovid, my complaints sound in meter.
And it's just, she knew exactly who she was and what she was here to do. She succeeded, I believe, in delivering a lot of these very revolutionary ideals by using and almost manipulating the vernacular form that was so common, and allowing it to bring a new message to the masses. So in the poem that I just read, A una rosa, we see themes on beauty, themes on vanity, on service, servitude, on the cyclical nature of life. These are classically elements of feminine wisdom that might not have been present in the church, but she was able to use the common vernacular forms that people were used to reading to deliver that new message in such a way that eventually the church even sought her out to write some verses that were used in some didactic verses. The symbolism of the rose, I think, is interesting as well, because, as I mentioned before, Sister Juana knew exactly who she was, that she was more of an intellectual than she was a mystic. And this divine rose reveals those feminine aspects of God. When we compare her to the works of Saint Teresa, who came about a century, maybe a century and a half before, we see that Saint Teresa's experience with God was a bit more fraught, a bit more tense. And Sister Juana's, in comparison, seems just, her work seems to be much more peaceful. The legacy of Sister Juana, and these are two nicknames that she was given during her life by her contemporaries. She is called La Decima Musa, which is to say the 10th muse, which is a direct reference to the 9 muses of Greece. And to say that she's the 10th one puts her on that same level of influence as the 9 muses. And the other is La Fénix Mexicana, which is the Mexican phoenix. And that is a reference to her work's ability to rise out of the ashes of the Inquisition and stand on its own.
And finally, Dane is going to tell you about San Juan de la Cruz, or St. John of the Cross, and his Dark Night of the Soul poem.
So, St. Juan was sort of a contemporary of St. Teresa. They were both sort of part of the same Counter-Reformation movement, and they were both mystics. So I'm not sure if we've explained this, but mysticism is sort of this idea that came around this time, which the Catholic Church really did not like, that one could achieve a sort of spiritual, the soul could leave the body and meet, or in some cases merge with God, or in this sort of, which is what this poem is mostly about, through spiritual practices. And again, the Catholic Church really did not like this. And unfortunately, San Juan was, at one point in his life, tortured because he pushed these ideas so much and so publicly. And as you can see, he did die pretty young. And most of his works were published posthumously. I always forget how to pronounce that. So we don't have an exact date for when this poem was published. So, as I said before, the mysticism, the idea of the soul leaving the body to merge with and meet with God, that is what he and Santa Teresa were talking about. So in this case, the poetic eye is the soul, his soul that leaves the house of his body in order to meet with God. And yeah, the line "amara en el amado transformada," I personally interpret as sort of his human love becoming divine through his practice and his merge with God. The symbolism of the white lily is, the color white is associated with purity. It's why sort of the same with enamorado y la muerte, that sort of pure divine love without earthly ties. And then in class, we talked about sort of a connection with a contemporary song, Aunque es la noche by Rosalía, which I don't know if I should play it, but it's sort of the same idea of this almost forbidden tryst in the night with someone. But in this poem, it's with God, so that's fun.
Thank you. So I really want to thank my Intro to Hispanic Literature students for putting together this presentation and for taking the time to come speak to you today. I hope that you found it interesting. We've really been enjoying making the connections and seeing how this topic, this theme of love juxtaposed with death kind of evolves over the centuries from the 15th century to the 17th century, and how the poet's relationship with both love and death changes according to the cultural context. So from, the inevitability, hard existential crisis of that death can come at any time, and that a lover can lead to death, to the Santa Teresa and San Juana's mystical alumbrados who were persecuted by the Inquisition for their belief that they didn't need sacraments and they didn't need a hierarchical church in order to join their soul with God, and that death was a freeing of the soul to join with the love interest who is God in divine love. So we see the sacro-profane, the mundane earthly love joined with the divine love in this lover's union, or this tryst as Dane described it. I really like the way you described that. And then finally, Sor Juana. So the way that she, from a more of an intellectually liberated woman, and how she treats the ideas of love and death in her poetry, with the Baroque wordiness, just the playing with the words, the intellectual playing with the words that we see in Baroque poetry in New Spain, and in the metropolis. So thank you very much. We're going to hand it over to Dr. Rebecca Lynham, who's going to talk to you about the Dance of Death in medieval and Renaissance Germany.
Okay, so Der Tod, death. So I thought we would start with Hans Holbein, which he actually did a woodcutting of the Dance of Death, and this was not the first one. So on the right there, we see an example of Der Todestanz, which was by Michael Wohlgemuth. So it actually shows people dancing around with skeletons, with death, kind of like, hey, we're hanging out, we're having a party, so woohoo, we're all gonna die, let's live it up big. But Hans Holbein, I'm going to show you some slides from his Dance of Death version, which was a little bit later than this one. It was about 30, 40 years later. So his was unique in that he shows people not dancing with death for the first time. So usually they were all skeletons dancing around. This one, he shows the skeletons creeping up on people. Death creeps up on them and just takes them. So, rich guy counting his money, takes him. Poor man plowing the field, takes him. So his was a little more, I guess, realistic, you would say, and not party-ish. Interesting fact, Hans Holbein actually illustrated Martin Luther's translation of the New Testament. So he was actually big into the Reformation. So he was, I think, trying to show that death was a little more realistic and maybe not as negative as sometimes we portray it to be. Interesting thing as well, the woodcuts that I'm going to show you, they were actually teeny tiny. And they were made to where you could ink them and put them in, you could put them in different books. But there were like 41 of them, and the guy who was printing them, death actually took him while he was printing them, ironically. So I thought we would look at this first, and then I want to take it to the 30 Years' War. Oh, wrong way. Okay, so we got a couple of examples here. I'm going to move where I can see them. We actually start with the Garden of Eden, expulsion from paradise. So you can see when they were expelled from paradise, death actually makes his grand entrance. Adam tills the soil. Well, he's basically playing with death his whole life. Death could take him at any time. Now, the interesting thing is Holbein actually puts categories here. So we've got the emperor, we've got the king, rich people, people with power, people who have influence. That doesn't play a role at all in their death. They're going to die anyway. So he shows them just making decisions as usual. Well, here's death hanging up above his head. Same thing with the king. Well, eating with death. He doesn't realize it. Great equalizer, right. And that's sort of what we were dealing with at the time. I mean, we'd been dealing with plague before this. The Germans call it die Pest, the pest. I mean, death was everywhere. It was a little more prevalent than nowadays, you know. We thankfully now we have modern medicine. Back then, not so much. Holbein really criticized the Catholic Church. So we know he illustrated part of Martin Luther's New Testament translation. He was really hard on the clergy and the fact that sometimes they seemed to think they were a little bit better, and maybe that would get them some, I guess, buy them some time from death, but no. Death is still here, taking the guy away, so if you're a bishop, doesn't matter, you're going to die anyway. Abbot, same thing, but he has several categories just on the categories in the Catholic Church. I thought this one was interesting, so sort of, you know, juxtaposition. We've got the poor man, the plowman. Well, we know he's going to die, but the miser, the rich man who thinks his riches may buy him some influence, not really. He's going to leave it behind. Can't take it with him. He can't even buy a longer life with it. So you can see, none of them are really dancing with death here. They're just living, and death takes them. The judge, so interesting thing here, we've got a corrupt judge favoring the rich man, ignoring the poor man, not giving him justice. Well, death's kind of got it in for him here. So it's, as Lee said, it's the great equalizer. Things are going to equal out. The monk, another one of the religious categories that he often criticized. The very last one is the child, and so I sort of put it next to the astrologer. But you know, sometimes we think if we have wisdom, maybe we can cheat death, maybe we can find a way out of it. Astrologers, known for their brains, known for their smarts, doesn't really help them. But maybe the unfair thing we see here is the poor child being taken away from his mother. So this one was very last, and I would probably say this is probably one of the more common scenes with death that we would see in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance with child mortality. So pretty much death is present everywhere. Doesn't matter if you're young or old, it's going to come for you. And I believe we saw this image in the Spanish presentation as well. Okay, so I'm going to admit, I'm gonna tie this in with 30 Years' War. There is a song called Es ist ein Schnitter, heißt der Tod. And you have a copy of it. I've got to say it's my absolute favorite song from this era. And it pretty much sums up the dance of death. Except this time, instead of a dance of death, we have a field of flowers. And there is a reaper. His name is Death, and he's cutting down flowers in the field. He's cutting down the tiny, tiny ones. He's cutting down the rich ones. He's cutting down all sorts of flowers, but the same thing is they're all getting mown down. Death is the great equalizer. Doesn't matter if he's portrayed cutting flowers down. They're all going, and they're going to be burned and thrown away. So this is actually this is one copy of it. It was actually written during the 30 Years' War, which that was from 1618 to 1648, and it was fought, well, there were a lot of themes of it, but one of them was Protestant versus Catholic, and it was a very messy war. It lasted for 30 years, obviously. Power switched from Catholic to Protestant all over the land, depending on which area you win. That was your religion. If you didn't like it, you could immigrate. Many battles were fought over it. This song actually appeared, it was, I think, around the late 1638, and it was on a Flugblatt. How would I translate that? A random piece of paper that you just distributed to people. And it's got, in one version, it has 80 verses. I've only given you the 6-verse version. It's probably the most well-known one, which is in the folk song book collection from back then. But it's been in Catholic songbooks. It's also been in Protestant songbooks. Some say it was from the Catholics, some say it was from Protestants. Pretty much the message is the same. Death is going to get you no matter how important you think you are. And that's actually supposed to be the video. Let's see if it actually works. Oh, wonderful. So rather than me sing, I'm just going to let you listen to this because you probably don't want to hear my singing voice. But if you look on the leaflet, well, let me get back to that. I've got the German on one side and I've got the English on the other. If you need the notes, I've got that on the back. For those of you who may know some German, this is old German. There may be a few grammatical things that we don't do nowadays. There may be some words that are shortened or lengthened. The version I've got here is one of the more popular ones that was recorded in 2015. Some of the words may be a little different, just there were lots of versions of this. But when I was studying for my doctorate up in Middlebury College, sometimes things got tough. And I would listen to this song and think, no matter how tough it is, it's going to be fine in the end. So let's get to the end very briefly before I play it. So basically through the whole poem, you're seeing, watch out, little flower. Death's coming for you. Watch out, little flower. We get to the very last two stanzas. The flower doesn't have to worry too much because the flower is going to be transplanted into the heavenly garden because the flower has faith in God and the flower is going to a better place in heaven. So at the end, the flower has got a little bit more confidence. Come on, death, I don't fear you. It's going to be fine. I'm going to a better place. I don't have to watch out for you anymore. And that was death. It's going to get you. Okay, questions for me? Any questions about my absolute favorite song from this time period?